Sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the one you can see coming. In the world of military special operations, legends are born not from brute force, but from the shadows where silence speaks louder than screams. What happens when a young woman enters a place designed to break the strongest men, carrying secrets that could change everything? What happens when those who think they know warfare discover they've been training alongside someone who has already mastered it in ways they never imagined? This is the story of Sarah Chen, a 22-year-old recruit who walked into Fort Bragg's most brutal training program with nothing but a worn duffel bag and eyes that held secrets deeper than any drill sergeant suspected. While her fellow recruits struggled with basic combat techniques, Sarah carried the weight of something far more dangerous, a past that had forged her in fires they couldn't comprehend, and skills that would soon reveal themselves in ways that would shake the very foundation of military hierarchy. In a world where respect is earned through sweat, blood, and unbreakable will, Sarah was about to discover that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not against the enemy in front of you, but against the assumptions of those who think they already know who you are. And sometimes, the most powerful moment comes not when you prove them wrong, but when someone who truly matters whispers the truth that changes everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground at Fort Bragg. As Sarah Chen stepped off the transport bus, her worn canvas duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Around her, dozens of other recruits shuffled nervously, their eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and terror that comes with entering one of the military's most demanding training programs. Sarah moved differently than the others, her steps measured and purposeful, as if she was walking through a familiar neighborhood rather than stepping into what many considered a crucible, designed to break the human spirit. Drill Sergeant Martinez stood at attention near the barracks entrance, his chest decorated with ribbons that told stories of battles fought in distant lands. His voice cut through the morning air like a blade as he began his welcoming speech, though welcome was hardly the word anyone would use to describe the verbal assault that followed. Sarah listened with the same calm expression she maintained while watching her fellow recruits flinch at every barked command. "You maggots think you're ready to serve your country?" Martinez's voice echoed off the concrete buildings. "You think because you did well in basic training, you're somehow special? Let me tell you something. This program has a 90% washout rate, and I personally guarantee that most of you will be crying for your mothers before the week is over." Sarah noticed how the other recruits shifted uncomfortably, their confidence already beginning to crack under the weight of Martinez's words. She remained still, her dark eyes taking in every detail of their surroundings. The layout of the buildings, the positioning of the guard posts, the rhythm of the patrols. All of it registered in her mind with the automatic precision of someone who had learned long ago that survival often depended on such observations. Among her fellow recruits, 3 individuals stood out. Marcus Thompson, a former college football player whose muscular frame suggested he was used to physical challenges. Jennifer Walsh, a sharp-eyed woman from Boston whose military bearing indicated previous service experience. And David Park, whose quiet intensity reminded Sarah of someone who had already seen more than most people his age should have. As they were marched to their quarters, Sarah found herself assigned to a bunk near the window. She methodically unpacked her few possessions, each item placed with deliberate care. Her movements caught the attention of Walsh, who had claimed the bunk across from hers. "You're awfully calm for someone about to enter Hell Week," Walsh observed, her Boston accent thick with curiosity. "Most people are either excited or terrified. You look like you're checking into a hotel." Sarah looked up, offering a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I figure there's no point in getting worked up about something before it happens. We'll find out soon enough what we're dealing with." Thompson, who had been struggling to fit his oversized clothing into a regulation locker, turned toward them. "Easy for you to say. You probably weigh what, 110 pounds soaking wet? Some of us have actual expectations to live up to." The comment hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah could feel the attention of several nearby recruits shifting toward their conversation. She continued folding a simple grey t-shirt, her movements unchanged by Thompson's words. "Weight doesn't determine strength," she replied quietly, "and assumptions usually say more about the person making them than the person they're aimed at." Before Thompson could respond, the sharp blast of a whistle cut through their conversation. Drill Sergeant Martinez appeared in the doorway, his presence immediately transforming the relaxed atmosphere into one of tense attention. "You have exactly 30 seconds to get your sorry hides outside and in formation," he announced. "And if I hear one more word of chatter, you'll all be doing push-ups until the sun goes down." The recruits scrambled toward the door, their previous conversations forgotten in the rush to avoid Martinez's wrath. Sarah moved with the group but without their panic, reaching the formation area with time to spare while others were still stumbling into position. The first day's training began with what Martinez called basic assessment. This involved a series of physical and mental challenges designed to establish baseline capabilities and identify potential weaknesses. Sarah watched as her fellow recruits tackled obstacle courses, marksmanship tests, and strategic planning exercises with varying degrees of success. When her turn came for the obstacle course, she approached the starting line with the same calm demeanor she had maintained since arrival. The course itself was an intimidating collection of walls, ropes, trenches, and barriers that had been designed to test every aspect of physical fitness and mental determination. "Chen!" Martinez called out, consulting his clipboard. "You're up. Let's see what you've got." Sarah nodded and took her position. At the signal, she began moving through the course with a fluid efficiency that immediately caught the attention of everyone watching. Where other recruits had struggled and fought against each obstacle, Sarah seemed to flow around and over them, with an economy of movement that spoke of extensive training. She scaled the 12-foot wall without using the provided rope, her fingers finding holds that others had missed entirely. At the rope climb, she moved upward with a steady rhythm that never seemed to strain her slight frame. The balance beam that had caused several recruits to fall was crossed with the confident steps of someone who had performed far more difficult feats. But it was at the final obstacle that Sarah's true capabilities became apparent. The kill house was a mock urban environment filled with targets that popped up at random intervals. Recruits were armed with laser tag equipment and tasked with neutralizing threats while avoiding civilian targets. Most participants approached it like a video game, moving cautiously and taking their time to line up shots. Sarah entered the structure and seemed to disappear. The observers outside could track her progress only by the rapid succession of successful target hits that registered on the monitoring equipment. She moved through the maze-like interior with a speed and precision that defied explanation, engaging targets that other recruits hadn't even noticed while maintaining perfect accuracy. When she emerged from the structure 90 seconds later, the silence that greeted her was profound. Her time was not only the best of the day, but according to the range instructor who checked the equipment twice, it was the third best time ever recorded on that particular course. Martinez stared at his stopwatch, then at Sarah, then back at his stopwatch. "Run it again," he ordered. Sarah's second run was 8 seconds faster than her first. That evening, as the recruits sat in the mess hall picking at their regulation dinners, the conversation inevitably turned to Sarah's performance. Thompson, his earlier bravado significantly dampened, struggled to reconcile what he had witnessed with his preconceived notions. "Where did you train before this?" Walsh asked directly, her curiosity now mixed with professional respect. Sarah looked up from her meal, considering her response carefully. "Different places. I've been preparing for this for a long time." Park, who had been quietly observing the conversation, leaned forward slightly. "That wasn't normal training. I've seen Special Forces veterans who couldn't move through that course the way you did. What's your background?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah could feel the weight of multiple conversations stopping as other recruits strained to hear her answer. She was saved from responding by the appearance of a figure most of them hadn't seen before. Colonel James Harrison was a man whose presence changed the atmosphere of any room he entered. Tall and lean, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, he moved through the mess hall with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. What made his appearance unusual was that officers of his rank rarely interacted directly with recruits during training. He stopped at Sarah's table, and she immediately stood at attention. The other recruits followed suit, though their movements were less crisp and automatic than hers. "At ease," Harrison said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that comes from years of leadership. His eyes remained focused on Sarah. "Chen, isn't it?" "Yes, sir. Walk with me." It wasn't a request, and Sarah fell into step beside the colonel as they left the mess hall. The remaining recruits watched through the windows as the two figures disappeared into the gathering dusk. Their conversation too distant to overhear, but their body language suggesting a familiarity that raised even more questions about Sarah's mysterious background.
Outside, Harrison led Sarah to a small courtyard area away from the main training grounds.
For several moments they walked in silence, the only sounds coming from the distant activities of the base, settling into its evening routine. "Your performance today was remarkable," Harrison finally said. "But I suspect you already know that." Sarah maintained her attention forward, her expression neutral. "I did my best, sir."
Harrison stopped walking and turned to face her directly.
In the fading light, his expression was unreadable but not unkind. "Chen, I've been in this business for 28 years. I've trained with some of the most elite warriors this country has ever produced. What I saw today wasn't the result of normal preparation or natural talent. That was professional-level execution. Sarah met his gaze steadily but offered no response. I'm not asking you to reveal classified information, Harrison continued. But I am telling you that your presence here has not gone unnoticed. There are people who are very interested in your progress, and that interest comes with both opportunities and responsibilities. The weight of his words settled between them like a physical presence. Sarah understood that this conversation was about more than her performance on an obstacle course. There were layers of meaning here that spoke to a larger picture she was only beginning to understand. Sir, I'm here to complete my training and serve my country to the best of my abilities, she replied carefully. Harrison nodded slowly. I'm sure you are, but I want you to understand something, Chen. The program you're in now is just the beginning. What comes after depends largely on how you handle the challenges ahead and how well you work with the team you're building here. He gestured toward the mess hall, where her fellow recruits were still visible through the windows. Those people in there are going to be looking to you for answers about what they witnessed today. How you handle that attention will tell me a great deal about whether you're ready for what comes next. Sarah followed his gaze toward the building where her fellow recruits continued their evening meal. She could see Thompson gesturing animatedly, probably still discussing her performance. Walsh appeared to be taking notes on a small pad, her analytical mind no doubt working to piece together the puzzle Sarah represented. Park sat quietly, but his posture suggested he was listening intently to every word being spoken. What would you recommend, sir? Sarah asked. Harrison's smile was barely visible in the growing darkness. Be yourself, but be smart about it. These people are going to be your teammates possibly for a very long time. Trust is built slowly and destroyed quickly. Build it wisely. With that, he turned and walked back toward the administrative buildings, leaving Sarah alone in the courtyard. She stood there for several minutes, processing not just the conversation but the implications of what lay ahead. When she finally returned to the mess hall, most of the recruits had finished their meals, but her table mates were still waiting. Everything okay? Walsh asked as Sarah reclaimed her seat. Fine, just routine check-in stuff. Thompson leaned forward, his curiosity overcoming his earlier embarrassment. Come on, Chen. Colonels don't do routine check-ins with recruits. What's really going on? Sarah looked around the table at their expectant faces. These people would indeed be her teammates, and Harrison's words about trust echoed in her mind. She made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I can't tell you everything, she said quietly, ensuring her voice wouldn't carry to other tables. But I can tell you that my training before coming here was more extensive than most people's. I'm here for the same reasons you are, to serve my country and become the best soldier I can be. The difference is that some people think I might be able to contribute in ways that go beyond normal service. Park nodded slowly. Special operations. It wasn't a question, and Sarah didn't confirm it directly. But her slight nod was enough to answer the unspoken questions that had been building since her performance on the obstacle course. Walsh tapped her pen against her notebook thoughtfully. So what happens now? Do we pretend we didn't see what we saw today? You treat me like any other member of this team, Sarah replied. Because that's exactly what I am, regardless of whatever else might be true. Thompson, who had been listening with growing understanding, finally spoke up. You know, when I made that comment earlier about weight and expectations, I was being an ass. Sarah's smile was genuine this time. Yes, you were. But we all make assumptions. The question is what we do after we realize we're wrong. The conversation that followed lasted well into the evening, long past the official end of mealtime. It was the beginning of bonds that would be tested in ways none of them could yet imagine, forged in honesty and mutual respect that would prove more valuable than any individual skill or talent. As they finally prepared to return to their quarters, Sarah realized that Colonel Harrison had been right about more than just the importance of trust. The program she was entering was indeed just the beginning, and the challenges ahead would require not just her own capabilities, but the combined strength of the team they were building together. That night, as she lay in her bunk listening to the quiet sounds of the barracks settling into sleep, Sarah reflected on the day's events. She had taken the first step into a world that would demand everything she had to give, and more than she yet knew she possessed. But for the first time since arriving at Fort Bragg, she felt like she might not be taking that journey alone. The second week of training brought challenges that pushed every recruit to their physical and mental limits. Dawn came early at Fort Bragg, announced by the harsh sound of reveille that cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a knife. Sarah was already awake when the bugle call echoed across the base. Her internal clock adjusted to a schedule that had been drilled into her through years of conditioning that her fellow recruits knew nothing about. As the barracks erupted into the controlled chaos of soldiers preparing for another day of trials, Sarah moved through her morning routine with the same measured efficiency that had marked her first day. Around her, Thompson struggled with equipment that seemed designed to frustrate rather than assist, while Walsh meticulously organized her gear with the precision of someone who understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between success and failure. Park remained the quiet observer he had been since their arrival, but Sarah had begun to notice the way his eyes tracked movement and his instinctive positioning that suggested training that went beyond basic military instruction. There were layers to David Park that reminded her of herself, though she suspected his secrets were different from her own. The morning's first challenge came in the form of what Drill Sergeant Martinez called trust exercises, though the term hardly captured the intensity of what they were about to face. The recruits were divided into 4-person teams and presented with scenarios that required absolute cooperation to complete successfully. Sarah found herself grouped with Walsh, Thompson, and Park, a combination that would prove more significant than any of them initially realized. Their first task involved navigating a series of obstacles while one team member was blindfolded and another was restricted to verbal communication only. The exercise was designed to test not just physical capabilities but the ability to work together under stress and uncertainty. Sarah volunteered to be blindfolded first, a decision that surprised her teammates given her demonstrated abilities. As Walsh secured the black cloth over her eyes, Sarah felt the familiar calm that came with operating in sensory-restricted conditions. This was not her first time moving through dangerous territory without the benefit of sight. "Okay, Chen," Thompson's voice came from somewhere to her right. "There's a low rope about 3 feet in front of you. You'll need to crawl under it, then immediately stand because there's a high rope right after that." Sarah moved forward, her hands extended to sense obstacles. But there was something in the way she navigated the space that caught Park's attention. She wasn't moving like someone who was blind and uncertain. She moved like someone who was using other senses to build a complete picture of her environment. "How are you doing that?" Park asked quietly, as Sarah successfully navigated a complex series of barriers that had caused other teams significant difficulty.
Doing what?
Sarah replied, though her slight smile suggested she knew exactly what he meant. "You're not moving like someone who can't see. You're moving like someone who's using different ways of seeing." Walsh, who was serving as their verbal navigator for this portion of the exercise, paused in her directions to observe Sarah more closely. There was indeed something unusual about the way Sarah moved through the obstacle course. Her steps were confident, her hand movements economical and purposeful, as if she was reading the environment through senses the rest of them barely understood how to use. When it was Thompson's turn to be blindfolded, the difference became even more apparent. Despite having 3 people providing verbal guidance, he moved hesitantly, his large frame struggling with obstacles that Sarah had navigated with apparent ease. His frustration was evident in his voice as he called for more specific directions. "This is impossible," Thompson muttered after the 3rd time he had walked into a barrier that his teammates had warned him about. "How is anyone supposed to do this without being able to see?" "You adapt," Sarah replied simply. "You learn to use what you have instead of focusing on what you don't." Park, who was currently restricted to verbal communication only, studied Sarah's face as she spoke. "That sounds like experience talking." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but there was a moment of consideration before she responded. "Everyone has to deal with limitations at some point. The question is whether you let them define what's possible or find ways to work around them." The morning's exercises continued with increasingly complex scenarios. Teams were required to move through simulated combat zones while carrying wounded teammates, navigate obstacle courses while maintaining communication with distant command posts, and solve tactical problems while under time pressure that left little room for extended discussion. Throughout each challenge, Sarah's performance remained consistently exceptional, but what began to set her apart was not just her individual capabilities, but the way she elevated the performance of her entire team. When Thompson struggled with rope climbing, Sarah positioned herself to provide subtle assistance that allowed him to maintain his dignity while completing the task. When Walsh became flustered during a time navigation exercise, Sarah's calm directions helped her regain focus and find the solution. It was during the afternoon's war games that the true nature of Sarah's background began to reveal itself in ways that could not be easily explained or dismissed. The exercise involved a simulated urban combat scenario, where teams of recruits were tasked with securing a mock village while avoiding civilian casualties and neutralizing threats that appeared at random intervals. Most teams approached the exercise with the methodical caution they had been taught in their basic training, moving slowly through the artificial streets while maintaining formation and communication protocols. Sarah's team found themselves assigned to secure the northern sector of the village, an area that included several buildings and multiple potential threat positions. As they approached their assigned sector, Sarah suddenly held up a hand, bringing the entire team to an immediate halt. Her teammates looked around, trying to identify whatever had caught her attention, but seeing nothing obvious. "What is it?" Walsh whispered, her weapon ready but uncertain where to aim it. Sarah's eyes scanned the buildings ahead of them with an intensity that seemed to penetrate beyond what was visible on the surface. "Third building on the right, second floor window. There's someone there." Thompson followed her gaze, squinting at the window she had indicated. "I don't see anything." "Trust me," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that had not been there during their previous exercises. Park, who had been watching Sarah's behavior with growing recognition, nodded slowly. "What do you want us to do?" "Park, take position behind that concrete barrier on the left. Thompson, you and Walsh circle around to the back of the building. Give me 3 minutes, then create a distraction at the rear entrance." Walsh hesitated. "Chen, we're supposed to work as a team. You can't just go off on your own." Sarah was already moving, her body low, and her movements flowing with a grace that seemed to make her nearly invisible against the backdrop of the mock village. "I'll be back," she called softly over her shoulder. What happened next unfolded with a speed and precision that left Sarah's teammates struggling to process what they were witnessing. Sarah approached the building she had identified through a route that seemed to take her through impossible spaces, using shadows and obstacles for cover in ways that made her progress nearly impossible to track. Within 2 minutes, she had reached the building and disappeared inside. Her teammates could hear the sounds of rapid movement and what appeared to be a brief scuffle, followed by silence. When Sarah emerged from the building a minute later, she was accompanied by one of the exercise supervisors, a sergeant who wore the expression of someone who had just experienced something completely unexpected. "Target neutralized," Sarah reported, as she rejoined her team, her breathing barely elevated despite the exertion of whatever had taken place inside the building. The sergeant who had accompanied her out of the building looked at the group with a mixture of confusion and respect. "I've been running these exercises for 6 years," he told them. "I've never had a recruit identify my position from that distance, much less neutralize it that quickly and quietly." Thompson stared at Sarah, as if seeing her for the first time. "How did you even know he was there?" "Training." Sarah replied, though the simplicity of her answer clearly didn't satisfy the curiosity of her teammates. The rest of the afternoon's exercises passed in a blur of successful completions that drew increasingly frequent attention from the training staff. By the time they returned to the barracks that evening, it was clear that Sarah's team had not only outperformed every other group, but had done so by margins that raised questions about the nature of Sarah's preparation and experience. That evening, as the recruits gathered for their daily briefing, Drill Sergeant Martinez stood before them with an expression that mixed pride with bewilderment. "Today's performance metrics show significant improvement across all teams," he announced. However, one team's results were so far beyond normal parameters that we're going to use them as a case study for the rest of the program. Sarah felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward her and her teammates. The attention was exactly what she had hoped to avoid, but the performance level required to help her team succeed had made anonymity impossible. "Team 4, Martinez continued, consulting his notes, completed every assigned task in record time while maintaining perfect safety protocols and tactical awareness. Chen, your target identification and neutralization in the urban exercise exceeded the performance of some of our advanced special operations candidates." The silence that followed this announcement was profound. Sarah could feel the mixture of awe, curiosity, and perhaps resentment from her fellow recruits. She had known this moment would come eventually, but that didn't make it any easier to navigate. "Sir," she said, standing at attention, "my team deserves credit for excellent cooperation and execution. Individual performance means nothing without team support." Martinez nodded appreciatively. "Spoken like a true soldier, Chen. But individual excellence that elevates team performance is exactly what we're looking for in this program." That night, as Sarah's team gathered for what had become their evening discussion session, the conversation took on a more serious tone than their previous casual exchanges. "Okay," Walsh said, settling onto a bunk with a notebook that had become considerably thicker over the past week. "I think it's time for some straight answers. What we saw today wasn't the result of normal military training, no matter how extensive. Park, who had been unusually quiet during the evening meal, leaned forward in his chair. The way you moved through that village, the target identification, the speed and precision of everything you did, that was professional level execution, special forces level. Thompson, his earlier competitiveness replaced by genuine respect, nodded in agreement. Chen, I don't care what the official story is. I know talent when I see it, and what you displayed today goes way beyond talent. That was training and experience that takes years to develop. Sarah looked around at the three faces watching her expectantly. These people had become more than teammates over the past week. They had become friends whose trust and respect meant something to her. The decision she made in that moment would affect not just their relationship, but potentially the entire trajectory of their shared future. You're right, she said finally. My training before coming here was more than just extensive, it was specialized. Walsh leaned forward. Specialized how? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing her words carefully.
I can't give you details about specific programs or operations.
But I can tell you that I've been preparing for service like this since I was 16 years old, and that preparation involved training with some of the most elite units in our military. Park's expression shifted as pieces of a puzzle began falling into place. You're already Special Forces, aren't you? This whole recruit program is just a cover for something else. I'm not Special Forces, Sarah replied honestly. But you're not wrong about this being more than it appears to be. Thompson shook his head in amazement. So what are we then? Are we all here for some special program, or are you the only one with a secret mission? Sarah's smile was rueful. I don't think any of us are here by accident. The question is what we do with whatever opportunities we're being given. The conversation that followed lasted well into the night, touching on ambitions, fears, and the growing sense that they were all part of something larger than a simple military training program. By the time they finally settled into sleep, the four of them had forged a bond that went beyond mere friendship or professional cooperation. But Sarah lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the attention her performance was drawing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and with them, new opportunities to either blend into the background or stand out in ways that might force her to reveal more than she was ready to share. In the darkness, she could hear the quiet sounds of the base settling into its nighttime routine. Guard patrols moving through their routes, the distant hum of communications equipment, the subtle noises that marked a military installation that never truly slept. These sounds had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, but tonight, they carried with them the weight of decisions that lay ahead. The training program was supposed to last 8 more weeks, but Sarah was beginning to suspect that her real education was just beginning. Whatever Colonel Harrison had meant about opportunities and responsibilities, she had a feeling she would find out soon enough. And when that moment came, the bonds she was building with her teammates might prove to be the most valuable preparation of all. The third week of training brought an unexpected shift in the program's structure. Instead of the standardized exercises that had marked their first 2 weeks, the recruits found themselves facing scenarios that seemed tailored to their individual capabilities and weaknesses. It was as if the training staff had been studying each recruit carefully and was now preparing customized challenges designed to push them beyond their comfort zones. For Sarah, this meant exercises that seemed specifically designed to test not just her physical abilities, but her capacity for leadership under increasingly complex and stressful situations. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable, and it confirmed her growing suspicion that this training program was serving multiple purposes beyond simple soldier development. The morning began with what Martinez announced as adaptive response training. Teams were given incomplete information about objectives that would change without warning, requiring them to adjust their strategies in real time while maintaining effectiveness and cohesion. It was the kind of challenge that separated soldiers who could follow orders from those who could think independently while maintaining team integrity. Sarah's team found themselves assigned to a scenario that involved securing a facility while protecting civilian personnel whose location and number were unknown. The only information they received was a basic floor plan and the knowledge that hostile forces were present but could be anywhere within the structure. This is designed to test decision-making under uncertainty, Walsh observed as they studied the limited intelligence they had been provided. They want to see how we handle situations where we can't plan everything in advance. Park nodded, his tactical mind already working through possibilities. The key is going to be staying flexible while maintaining enough structure to respond effectively to whatever we encounter. Thompson, who had grown significantly in confidence over the past weeks, pointed to a section of the floor plan. If we split into pairs, we can cover more ground while still maintaining mutual support. But we'll need some kind of communication system to coordinate. Sarah listened to her teammates' analysis while studying the floor plan with the intensity of someone reading a language others couldn't quite comprehend. There were aspects of the layout that suggested this was more than a simple training exercise, details that spoke to her experience with real-world operations. "There's something else," she said quietly, tracing a pattern on the floor plan with her finger. "This layout matches a specific type of facility. The room sizes, the corridor widths, the placement of what they're calling emergency exits. This is designed to simulate a research installation or data center." Her teammates looked at the floor plan with new eyes, seeing the details that Sarah's observation had highlighted. What they had initially taken for a generic building layout suddenly revealed itself as something much more specific and complex. "You're right," Walsh said slowly. "Which means the civilian personnel we're supposed to protect might not just be random people. They could be high-value assets with specialized knowledge." Park's expression grew serious. "And the hostile forces might not just be generic bad guys. This could be a simulation of corporate espionage or state-sponsored infiltration." As if summoned by their analysis, Drill Sergeant Martinez appeared at their table. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his posture that suggested their conversation had been overheard and evaluated. "Team 4, he announced. "You have 5 minutes to finalize your approach. Transport to the exercise area leaves in 10 minutes. After Martinez departed, Sarah gathered her teammates closer. "Whatever this exercise is really about, we need to be prepared for it to be more realistic than anything we've faced so far. Stay alert, watch each other's backs, and remember that sometimes the most important part of an operation is knowing when the rules have changed." The facility they were transported to was unlike the mock villages and obstacle courses they had been using for previous exercises. This was a genuine multi-story building that had been converted for training purposes, complete with working security systems, realistic furnishings, and an attention to detail that made it feel more like a real operation than a training exercise. As they approached the building, Sarah noticed surveillance cameras that were clearly functional, communication equipment that appeared to be military-grade, and security measures that went far beyond what would be necessary for a simple training scenario. Whatever they were walking into, it represented a significant investment of resources and planning. "Chen," Park said quietly as they prepared their equipment, "this doesn't feel like a drill anymore." Sarah nodded, checking her gear with the automatic precision of someone preparing for actual combat. "No, it doesn't, but that doesn't change what we need to do. We go in, complete our mission, protect any civilians we find, and get everyone out safely." The insertion into the building began like their previous exercises, with careful movement and tactical communication that had become second nature over the past weeks. But within minutes, it became clear that they were dealing with something far more sophisticated than their earlier challenges. The hostile forces they encountered were not the usual training staff wearing obvious instructor gear. These individuals moved with professional precision, used actual tactical equipment, and demonstrated a level of competence that matched or exceeded what Sarah's team had developed. More significantly, they seemed to be taking the exercise as seriously as if it were a real operation. "Contact front," Thompson whispered into his communication device as he spotted movement in a corridor ahead of them. "2 individuals, professional movement, real weapons." Sarah, who was monitoring their advance from an overwatch position, felt her pulse quicken as she realized the implications of Thompson's report. Real weapons in a training exercise represented either a massive breach of safety protocols or an indication that this was something other than a standard training scenario. "Confirm real weapons," she replied quietly. "Exercise caution but maintain mission parameters." What followed was a 20-minute engagement that tested every skill they had developed, and several they had never been formally taught. The opposing force demonstrated tactics that were clearly beyond standard military training, using electronic countermeasures, coordinated flanking maneuvers, and equipment that Sarah recognized from her previous experience with classified operations. But it was during the search for civilian personnel that the true nature of the exercise became clear. In a secured area on the building's second floor, Sarah's team discovered 3 individuals who were clearly not part of the usual training staff. They wore civilian clothes but carried themselves with the bearing of professionals, and their reaction to the team's arrival suggested they had been briefed on the exercise's parameters. "Are you here to extract us?" asked one of the civilians. A middle-aged woman whose calm demeanor under stress suggested extensive experience with emergency situations. "That's affirmative," Walsh replied, "following established protocols. We're here to ensure your safety and escort you to a secure location." But as they prepared to move the civilians to safety, Sarah noticed something that made her reassess everything they had encountered. One of the civilians was carrying a briefcase that appeared to be equipped with a biometric lock, and another had what looked like encrypted communication equipment. These were not random people playing the role of civilians. They were professionals involved in whatever larger scenario this exercise was designed to simulate. The extraction phase of the operation required navigating through opposition that seemed determined to prevent their success. Sarah found herself relying on skills and training that went far beyond what she had officially learned in any military program, moving through the building with a level of expertise that drew pointed looks from the civilians they were protecting.
"You're not a typical recruit, are you?" asked the woman with the briefcase, during a brief pause in their movement.
Sarah met her gaze steadily. "I'm a soldier doing my job, ma'am." The woman's smile suggested she understood more about Sarah's background than she was letting on. "Of course you are." By the time they successfully extracted all civilian personnel and neutralized the hostile forces, Sarah's team had completed what was arguably the most complex and realistic training exercise any of them had ever participated in. But the aftermath of the exercise raised more questions than it answered. Instead of the usual immediate debriefing that followed training exercises, they were told to secure their equipment and report to a different building for administrative processing. The civilians they had extracted disappeared into vehicles that looked more like official government transportation than typical training support. "Did that feel like a training exercise to you?" Thompson asked as they walked toward their debriefing location. Park shook his head. "That felt like the real thing. The equipment, the opposition, even the civilians, none of that was standard training material." Walsh, who had been unusually quiet since the completion of the exercise, finally spoke up. "I think we just participated in something that was either a very sophisticated test or an actual operation disguised as training." Sarah remained silent, but she was thinking the same thing. The level of realism, the quality of the opposition, and the apparent authenticity of the civilians they had extracted all pointed to something far more significant than a training exercise. Their suspicions were confirmed when they arrived at the debriefing location and found Colonel Harrison waiting for them, accompanied by several other officers, whose presence and bearing suggested they held positions of considerable authority within the military hierarchy. "Team 4, Harrison announced as they entered the room. "Please be seated." The tone of the meeting was immediately different from any previous interaction they had experienced during their training. These officers were not conducting a routine training debrief. They were evaluating the results of something that had genuine operational significance. "What you participated in today," Harrison began, "was a practical assessment that served multiple purposes. Yes, it was a training exercise designed to test your capabilities under realistic conditions, but it was also an operational scenario that had real-world implications." Sarah felt her teammates' attention focus with laser intensity as the implications of Harrison's words sank in. They had not simply been playing war games, they had been involved in something that mattered beyond their own training and development. "The facility you secured contains research data that is genuinely important to national security," one of the other officers explained. "The civilian personnel you extracted are actual researchers whose work has strategic significance. While the threat was simulated, the protective measures and extraction procedures you employed were entirely real." Walsh leaned forward slightly. "Sir, are you telling us that this entire training program has been a cover for operational activities?" Harrison's expression suggested approval for the directness of her question. "I'm telling you that your training has reached a point where the distinction between simulation and reality becomes less meaningful. You have demonstrated capabilities that qualify you for missions that require both exceptional skill and absolute discretion." Thompson, who was still processing the revelation that their exercise had been something more than training, raised his hand tentatively. "What does this mean for our future assignments?" "It means," Harrison replied, "that you have an opportunity to serve your country in ways that go far beyond conventional military roles. But it also means that from this point forward, the stakes of everything you do will be considerably higher." Sarah had remained silent throughout the exchange, but she could feel Harrison's attention focusing on her with particular intensity. When he spoke again, his words were directed primarily toward her. "Chen, your performance today confirmed assessments that have been building throughout your time in this program. You have demonstrated not just exceptional individual capabilities, but the ability to lead and elevate the performance of those around you under the most demanding conditions." The weight of his words settled over the room like a physical presence. Sarah understood that whatever came next would represent a fundamental shift in her military career and quite possibly her life. "What are you offering us, sir?" she asked directly. Harrison's smile was barely visible, but it carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate moment. I'm offering you the chance to find out what you're really capable of, Chen. All of you. The meeting concluded with instructions to return to their regular training schedule while awaiting further orders, but Sarah knew that their time as ordinary recruits was effectively over. Whatever lay ahead would test not just their abilities, but their commitment to something larger than themselves. That evening, as her team processed what they had learned, the conversation was markedly different from their previous discussions. They were no longer speculating about their future. They were preparing for a reality that none of them had fully anticipated when they first arrived at Fort Bragg. "So what do we do now?" Thompson asked, his voice carrying a seriousness that had not been there in previous weeks. Sarah looked around at the three people who had become not just her teammates, but her trusted friends. "We do what soldiers do," she replied. "We prepare for whatever comes next and we make sure we're ready to serve our country when we're called upon." But privately, Sarah knew that their real journey was just beginning. The training program had been preparation for something larger, and now that preparation was about to be put to the test in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and their capabilities. The fourth week brought changes that transformed not just the nature of their training, but the very environment in which they operated. Sarah and her team were moved from the standard recruit barracks to a secure facility that required special clearance to enter. The message was clear. They were no longer part of the regular training program, but something far more specialized and consequential. Their new quarters reflected this shift in status. Instead of the Spartan accommodations they had grown accustomed to, they found themselves in individual rooms that offered both privacy and the kind of security measures typically reserved for personnel handling classified materials. Each room was equipped with communications equipment, secure storage for personal items, and access to resources that went far beyond what ordinary recruits would ever need. But with these upgraded accommodations came responsibilities and restrictions that made clear the serious nature of what they were now involved in. Their movements were monitored, their communications were subject to security protocols, and their access to outside contact was limited to specific times and circumstances. "This feels more like protective custody than upgraded housing," Walsh observed during their first morning in the new facility. Park, who had spent time examining the security features of his room, nodded in agreement. "The level of monitoring and control here is consistent with classified operations. Whatever we're being prepared for, it involves information and activities that someone considers highly sensitive." Sarah had noticed the same things, but her reaction was different from her teammates. The security measures and restrictions felt familiar rather than concerning, as if she was returning to an environment she had known before rather than entering something entirely new. Thompson, who was still adjusting to the rapid changes in their situation, seemed less comfortable with their new circumstances. "I keep thinking about my family," he admitted. "They think I'm in basic special forces training. How do I explain that I can't tell them where I am or what I'm doing?" It was a concern that all of them shared to varying degrees. The transition from normal military service to whatever they were now involved in required not just professional adaptation, but personal sacrifices that none of them had fully anticipated when they first volunteered for the program. Their first briefing in the new facility was conducted by a team of officers and civilian personnel that Sarah immediately recognized as intelligence professionals. The formality and security protocols surrounding the meeting left no doubt that they were now operating at a level of classification that carried serious legal and personal implications. Colonel Harrison presided over the briefing, but he was joined by individuals whose credentials and authority clearly exceeded his own. The presence of civilian intelligence officers, military specialists with classifications that were not openly discussed, and technical personnel whose expertise extended far beyond conventional military operations indicated that whatever they were being prepared for represented a significant investment of resources and planning. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, "welcome to Phase 2 of your training in service. What you have demonstrated over the past 3 weeks has qualified you for participation in operations that require capabilities and clearances that very few military personnel ever achieve." One of the civilian briefers, a woman whose professional demeanor suggested extensive experience with classified operations, took over the presentation. "The program you are now part of involves missions that operate at the intersection of military action, intelligence gathering, and technological warfare. Your success will depend not just on individual excellence, but on your ability to function as a coordinated unit under conditions that combine extreme stress with absolute secrecy." Sarah found herself studying the faces of the briefers as much as listening to their words. There was something in their expressions and body language that suggested they knew more about her background than they were revealing, and that her presence in this program was not the result of her performance during training alone. "The first phase of your advanced training will involve familiarization with equipment and techniques that are not part of standard military education. The civilian briefer continued. You will be working with technologies that are classified at levels that require specific security clearances and sworn commitments to confidentiality that extend far beyond your military service. Park raised his hand. What happens if one of us decides this isn't what we signed up for? Do we have the option to return to conventional service? The question hung in the air for a moment before Harrison responded. The honest answer is that the knowledge and clearances you will receive make returning to conventional service complicated but not impossible. However, the commitments you make here will follow you for the rest of your military career and beyond. Walsh leaned forward. What kind of missions are we talking about? Are we being prepared for combat operations, intelligence work, or something else entirely? All of the above, replied one of the military specialists. Modern warfare requires capabilities that cross traditional boundaries between different types of operations. You'll be trained to handle situations that might involve direct action, intelligence gathering, technological warfare, or any combination of these elements. The briefing continued for 2 hours, covering topics that ranged from advanced combat techniques to electronic warfare, from psychological operations to international law as it applied to classified missions. By the time it concluded, Sarah's team had a much clearer understanding of what they were being prepared for, though many questions remained unanswered. That evening, as they gathered in a secure conference room that had been designated for their team meetings, the conversation was markedly different from their previous discussions. They were no longer speculating about their future. They were trying to understand the implications of choices they were being asked to make. Are we comfortable with this? Thompson asked directly. Because once we commit to this level of classification and responsibility, there's no going back to being ordinary soldiers. Walsh had been taking notes throughout the briefing, and she consulted them now as she organized her thoughts. The opportunities they're describing are incredible. The chance to serve at this level, to be involved in operations that could have genuine strategic importance, it's what I always hoped military service could offer. Park's perspective was more cautious. The opportunities are real, but so are the risks. Once we're involved in operations at this level of classification, we become permanent security concerns. Our personal lives, our families, our future career options, everything becomes subject to oversight and restriction. Sarah listened to her teammates' concerns while processing her own complicated relationship with what was being offered. For her, the transition to classified operations felt less like entering unknown territory and more like acknowledging realities that had already been part of her life for years. What we're being offered, she said finally, is the chance to serve our country in ways that most people never get to experience. But Park is right about the costs. Once we cross this line, we take on responsibilities and restrictions that will affect every aspect of our lives. The discussion continued well into the night, touching on personal values, professional ambitions, and the weight of serving something larger than themselves. By morning, all 14 members had reached the same conclusion. They would commit to the advanced program, but they would do so with full awareness of what they were accepting. The second day in their new facility brought the beginning of what their instructors called specialized capability development. This involved training with equipment and techniques that existed at the cutting edge of military technology, some of which were still in development phases that required security clearances just to observe. Sarah's first introduction to this advanced training involved weapons systems that incorporated artificial intelligence, communication equipment that could operate through electronic warfare, environments that would disable conventional systems, and surveillance technology that seemed to belong more in science fiction than military reality. But it was during a demonstration of advanced infiltration techniques that Sarah's true background finally became impossible to conceal. The instructor, a Special Forces veteran with decades of experience in classified operations, was demonstrating methods for bypassing electronic security systems when Sarah quietly pointed out a vulnerability in his approach. The technique you're showing works against systems that are 5 years old, she observed. But current installations use adaptive algorithms that would detect that approach within seconds.
The instructor paused, studying Sarah with new attention.
You sound like you have experience with current systems. Sarah realized she had revealed more than she intended, but the moment had passed the point where evasion was possible. Yes, sir. I do. The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. Her teammates, who had grown accustomed to Sarah's exceptional capabilities but had never questioned their source this directly, now understood that her background went far beyond anything they had imagined. Chen, the instructor said carefully, what's your actual background? Because what you just demonstrated isn't knowledge that comes from standard military training. Sarah looked around at her teammates, seeing in their faces a mixture of curiosity, concern, and perhaps a degree of betrayal. She had always known this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier to navigate. "I've been involved in classified operations since I was 18, she said quietly. "The training program you know me from wasn't my first assignment. It was part of preparation for a specific mission that required integration with a team that had developed through conventional channels." Thompson stared at her as if seeing a stranger. "You mean you've been undercover this entire time? Everything we've been through together, all the training, the team building, it was all part of some kind of operation?" "No," Sarah replied firmly. "The team we've built, the relationships we've developed, the trust we've established, that's all real. But it's true that my presence here was part of a larger plan that I couldn't discuss until now. Walsh, ever analytical, was already working through the implications. So, our selection for this advanced program wasn't based on our performance during training. We were identified beforehand as candidates for whatever this real mission is going to be." "Partly," Sarah admitted. "But your performance during training was genuine, and your qualifications for this program are based on your own capabilities, not just your compatibility with my mission requirements." Park had remained quiet during this exchange, but his expression suggested he was processing information that went beyond what was being discussed openly. "What exactly is this mission we're being prepared for?" he asked. Before Sarah could respond, the instructor intervened. "That's a conversation that needs to happen in a more formal briefing with appropriate authorization levels. But I can tell you that what you've just learned about Chen's background explains why this team was selected for an operation that requires both exceptional individual capabilities and perfect team coordination." The remainder of that day's training proceeded with a tension that had not existed before. Sarah's teammates were professional enough to continue working together effectively, but the revelation of her true background had introduced questions about trust, honesty, and the nature of their relationships that would need to be addressed before they could move forward as an effective unit. That evening, their team meeting took on the character of a crisis management session. Sarah found herself in the position of explaining not just her background, but the reasons she had not been able to reveal it sooner. "I need you to understand," she told them, "that keeping my background classified wasn't about not trusting you. It was about protecting both the mission and your own security clearances. The less you knew about certain aspects of this operation, the safer you were." Thompson's anger was evident but controlled. "But we had a right to know that we were being evaluated for something specific, not just general special operations."
"We had a right to make informed decisions about our participation."
Sarah nodded. "You're absolutely right, and I'm sorry that the nature of the operation made that impossible until now. But now you know, and you have the opportunity to make fully informed decisions about whether you want to continue." Walsh had been taking notes throughout their discussion, and she looked up from her pad with a question that cut to the heart of their situation. "What exactly is this mission, Sarah? What are we really being prepared for?" Sarah looked around at the three people who had become her closest friends and most trusted teammates. The moment had come to reveal the truth that would determine whether they remained together as a unit or whether the bonds they had forged would be shattered by the weight of secrets that had always existed beneath the surface. "We're being prepared," she said quietly, "to prevent a terrorist attack that intelligence services have been tracking for more than 2 years. An attack that, if successful, would result in casualties that could number in the thousands and economic damage that could destabilize entire regions." The silence that followed was absolute. Her teammates stared at her as the implications of what she had revealed settled over them like a physical weight. "And you've been part of tracking this threat from the beginning," Park said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes. And the success of the mission to prevent it depends on having a team that can operate at the highest levels of capability while maintaining absolute secrecy. A team exactly like the one we've built together." The conversation that followed would determine not just their professional future, but the fate of an operation that had been years in the planning and might represent the difference between public safety and catastrophe on a scale that none of them had imagined when they first arrived at Fort Bragg for what they thought was advanced military training. The final week of their training began with a briefing that laid bare the full scope of what they had been preparing for. Colonel Harrison was joined by representatives from multiple intelligence agencies, senior military leadership, and civilian officials whose presence indicated that the operation they were about to undertake had approval at the highest levels of government. Sarah sat with her teammates in a secure conference room that had been cleared for discussions at classification levels that required special authorization just to enter. The weight of what they were about to learn hung in the air like an electrical charge, and she could feel the tension radiating from Thompson, Walsh, and Park as they prepared to understand the true nature of their mission. The threat you are being asked to address, began a civilian official whose credentials identified her as a senior intelligence analyst, involves a terrorist organization that has spent 3 years developing the capability to launch coordinated attacks on critical infrastructure targets across multiple cities simultaneously. A series of satellite images and intelligence photos appeared on the screens around the room, showing locations that Sarah recognized as major metropolitan areas, power generation facilities, and transportation hubs that served millions of people daily. The organization calls itself the New Dawn Coalition, the analyst continued. Their membership includes former military personnel from several countries, civilian experts in engineering and computer systems, and financial support from sources that include both foreign governments and private entities with interests in destabilizing Western economies. Walsh leaned forward, studying the intelligence materials with the focused attention she brought to every complex problem. What's their specific target and timeline? Their primary target is a coordinated attack on the electrical grid serving the eastern seaboard, replied a military intelligence officer. The attack is designed to cause cascading failures that would leave major cities without power for weeks or potentially months. Secondary targets include transportation networks, communication systems, and financial data centers. Thompson's face had gone pale as the implications became clear. How many casualties are we talking about? Conservative estimates suggest immediate casualties in the thousands, with long-term effects that could impact millions. Harrison answered. Hospitals without power, transportation systems paralyzed, economic disruption on a scale that could trigger international instability. Park, who had remained silent throughout the briefing, finally spoke up. What makes you think a 4-person team can stop something of this magnitude? This sounds like it would require massive resources and coordination. It was then that Sarah understood why she had been placed with this specific team, and why their training had followed the path it had. The answer to Park's question lay not in overwhelming force, but in precision and capabilities that conventional military responses could not provide. The key to stopping this attack, Sarah said, drawing the attention of everyone in the room, isn't to fight the entire organization. It's to neutralize their coordination capabilities and eliminate the specific expertise that makes the attack possible. The civilian analyst nodded approvingly. Exactly. Our intelligence indicates that the success of their operation depends on a small number of individuals with specialized knowledge and a central command structure that coordinates timing across multiple targets. Remove those elements and the entire operation collapses. Harrison consulted his notes before continuing. Chen's background includes experience with operations that require precisely this type of surgical approach. Her integration with your team was designed to create a unit capable of infiltrating and neutralizing the command structure while operating under conditions that would make conventional military response impossible. Sarah could feel her teammates processing not just the scope of the mission, but the realization that their months of training had been specifically designed to prepare them for this moment. Every exercise, every challenge, every team-building experience had been part of a larger plan to forge them into the weapon needed to stop a catastrophe. Where is this command structure located? Walsh asked, her analytical mind already working through the tactical implications. Multiple locations, replied the military intelligence officer, but our intelligence indicates that the final coordination phase of their operation will take place from a facility in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, a location that is heavily defended, electronically isolated, and positioned to coordinate with cells across multiple time zones. Thompson shook his head slowly. Afghanistan. Of course it's Afghanistan. The briefing continued for several more hours, covering intelligence assessments, operational timelines, extraction procedures, and contingency plans that accounted for dozens of potential complications. By the time it concluded, Sarah's team had a complete understanding of what they were being asked to do and why their specific combination of skills made them uniquely qualified to attempt it. But understanding the mission was only the beginning. The final phase of their training involved preparation for an operation that would test every capability they had developed and push them beyond anything they had previously imagined. Over the next 4 days, they worked with equipment that existed at the absolute cutting edge of military technology. Weapon systems that incorporated artificial intelligence to enhance accuracy and reduce collateral damage. Communication devices that could operate in electronic warfare environments designed to disable conventional military equipment. Surveillance and infiltration tools that seemed to blur the line between current technology and science fiction. Sarah found herself in the position of both teammate and instructor, sharing knowledge from her previous classified operations while learning new techniques that had been developed specifically for this mission. The irony was not lost on her that she was simultaneously the most experienced and least informed member of the team. Having extensive operational background, but limited knowledge of the specific threat they were being asked to address. The technology they're giving us access to, Park observed during one of their planning sessions, represents capabilities that most military units don't know exist. Whatever the classification level of this mission, it's high enough that they're willing to reveal equipment that they normally keep completely secret. Walsh had been studying the intelligence materials with obsessive attention to detail, and her analysis revealed patterns that had implications beyond the immediate mission. This terrorist organization has been preparing for their attack for 3 years, but our intelligence about their plans is remarkably detailed. Either we have sources inside their organization, or we've been tracking them through methods that they don't know about. Probably both, Sarah replied. Operations at this level usually involve multiple intelligence streams, including human assets, electronic surveillance, and analysis techniques that combine information from sources that targets never suspect. Thompson, who had initially struggled with the transition from conventional military training to classified operations, had emerged as the team's specialist in operational logistics and contingency planning. "What concerns me," he said, "is that we're being asked to stop an attack that has been in development for 3 years, using a team that has been training together for only 1 month. The timeline suggests that something has accelerated their operational schedule." Sarah had been thinking the same thing, and the implications were troubling.
You're right.
Which means either our intelligence about their timeline was wrong, or something has happened that has forced them to move faster than they originally planned. The answer to that question came during their final briefing, conducted by Colonel Harrison and a senior CIA official whose presence indicated that the operation had reached the highest levels of government authorization. New intelligence received within the past 48 hours, the CIA official announced, indicates that the New Dawn coalition has moved their operational timeline forward by several weeks. They are now planning to launch their attack within the next 10 days. The silence that followed was profound as the implications settled over the room. Their preparation time had been cut short, and they would be deploying for an operation of unprecedented importance with less readiness than anyone had planned for. "Why the acceleration?" Sarah asked. "Our analysts believe they have detected signs of our surveillance and are moving to launch their attack before we can develop effective countermeasures," Harrison replied. "Which means your mission timeline has changed as well. You deploy in 36 hours. The final day and a half of preparation passed in a blur of equipment checks, final briefings, and personal preparations that each team member approached according to their own psychological needs. Thompson spent time writing letters that would be held in secure storage and delivered to his family only if the mission went badly. Walsh reviewed and re-reviewed every piece of intelligence and operational planning until she could recite mission parameters from memory. Park engaged in physical and mental conditioning routines that prepared him for the stress and demands of high-stakes operations. Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. 4 months earlier, she had been a classified operative without a permanent team, preparing for an assignment that she understood only in general terms. Now she was part of a unit that had become more than a professional team. They had become a family whose bond had been forged through shared challenges, mutual trust, and a common commitment to something larger than themselves. On the evening before their deployment, the 4 of them gathered for what might be their final team meeting in the secure facility that had become their home. The conversation was different from their previous discussions, marked by an awareness that everything they had worked toward was about to be put to the ultimate test. "Whatever happens over the next few days," Thompson said, "I want you all to know that training with you has been the most meaningful experience of my military career." Walsh nodded in agreement. "We came into this as strangers from different backgrounds, and we're leaving as a team that can accomplish things that none of us could have imagined individually." Park's contribution was characteristically thoughtful. "The mission we're about to undertake will test everything we've learned and everything we believe about ourselves. But I can't think of 3 people I'd rather face the test with." Sarah looked around at the 3 people who had become her closest friends and most trusted teammates. 4 months ago, I was assigned to work with you because analysts thought our capabilities would complement each other operationally. They were right about that, but they couldn't have predicted what else we would become together." The conversation continued late into the night, touching on hopes, fears, and the weight of responsibility they were accepting by agreeing to attempt something that could affect the safety and security of millions of people. By the time they finally separated to make their individual preparations for deployment, they had reinforced the bonds that would need to sustain them through whatever lay ahead. The next morning brought the final moment of their preparation phase. As they boarded the aircraft that would transport them to their operational area, Sarah felt the familiar combination of anticipation and calm focus that always marked the transition from training to real-world operations. But this time was different. This time she was not operating alone or with a team of strangers brought together for a single mission. This time she was part of something that had been forged through months of shared experience, mutual respect, and a trust that had been tested and proven under the most demanding conditions. As their aircraft lifted off from Fort Bragg and headed toward a destination that would test everything they had learned and everything they believed about themselves, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had entered the training program as an individual operative with exceptional capabilities but limited experience, working as part of a permanent team. She was leaving as part of a unit that represented something new in military operations, a combination of individual excellence and team cohesion that had been specifically designed to address threats that conventional forces could not handle. Whatever awaited them in the mountains of Afghanistan, they would face it together, drawing on capabilities that none of them could have developed alone. The mission that lay ahead would determine not just the success of their operation, but the validation of an entirely new approach to special operations that combined the best elements of individual expertise with the multiplied effectiveness of perfect team coordination. In the cargo hold of a military transport aircraft flying toward one of the most dangerous places on Earth, 4 soldiers prepared to discover whether months of preparation had forged them into the weapon their country needed to prevent a catastrophe that could reshape the geopolitical landscape. Colonel Harrison's words echoed in Sarah's mind as she checked her equipment one final time. Find out what you're really capable of. In less than 24 hours, they would have their answer.